and his successor not due to arrive for 3 months, the settlers made their move. On July 10th, Michael Blundell, the leader of the settlers, introduced a motion in the Legislative Council calling for stern measures against a subversive organization which he said was spreading like a disease through the colony. The acting authorities refused to accept this view or admit that new laws were necessary. Over the next few weeks, the settlers held a series of meetings. They threatened to take the law into their own hands unless the government declared a state of emergency, arrested the nationalist leaders, and issued a statement that nationalism on West African lines was not the official policy in Kenya.
A month or two before the emergency was actually declared, many of us felt something was going to happen. And we had rumors that perhaps Mr. Kenyatta would be arrested, together with the other members of the committee of the Kenya-African Union. What was going to happen, of course, we couldn't foresee at that time.
On the 19th of August, the acting governor denied categorically that there was a state of emergency in the colony. The government could not stop nationalism, he said. It could only try to guide it. Now the settlers began to talk of vigilante groups. They began to attribute every crime to Mau Mau. Every murder, every theft, every sullen look, every hostile stare was the work of Mau Mau. The Kenya government, more worried by the threat of a settler revolt than an African one, agreed to consider special laws to suppress African politics.
We were not taken by complete surprise, as we knew something was going to be done to try and keep down the movement, which was now have taken tremendous proportion in agitating for self-government.
On September the 16th, several Kenya officials flew to London to persuade the Colonial Office that the proposed laws were necessary to control subversion. This was the first time the British government was informed directly of what was going on. A week later, 7 new ordinances were passed and held ready for the arrival of the governor, whose signature would make them law. On September the 29th, more than 3 months after Mitchell's retirement, the new governor arrived. Sir Evelyn Baring was welcomed at Nairobi airport by settlers and government officials alike, for there was now an opportunity to bring things to a head. On September the 30th, Baring was sworn in as governor. On October the 3rd, he signed the new legislation. He was then taken for a brief tour of the rural areas where Mau Mau was allegedly operating. On October the 7th, while Baring was still on tour, the incident for which the settlers had waited took place. Senior Chief Waruhiu, one of the government's most loyal supporters, was assassinated. On October the 9th, Baring returned to Nairobi. He immediately cabled the Colonial Office, requesting permission to declare a state of emergency. The movement has many heads, Baring wrote. We are dealing with a hydra. It is now abundantly clear that we are facing a planned revolutionary movement. If the movement cannot be stopped, there will be an administrative breakdown, followed by bloodshed amounting to civil war. European farmers are very reasonable, but all indications are that there will be a planned assassination of Europeans. Reprisals will then be absolutely inevitable. At this point, 10 days before the emergency began, not one European settler had been killed. On October the 14th, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Oliver Littleton, approved Baring's request. First the Kenya government, and now the British government, had in effect accepted the settlers' concept of Mau Mau. It remained only to convince the world. On October the 20th, the war began.
Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have flown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart. All have to be carefully checked by police security men, for in such a decisive swoop as this, it is all too easy for the innocent to suffer. Nairobi police have been supplemented by hundreds of civilians, many of them women, to help round up the Mau Mau bandits. Radio-controlled cars with armored vehicles are used to carry out the army's plans for bringing in all suspects. More than 3,500 have been arrested already.
It is difficult to describe the sense of relief which overcame me, Michael Blundell later wrote. I felt as if a great load had been lifted from me, as I thought of the pressures which we had exerted earlier and the uncooperative way in which they had been met.
All who carry the mark of the Mau Mau must be hunted out so that peace may come to this troubled colony.
Having authorized the state of emergency, it was necessary for the Colonial Secretary, on behalf of the British government, to discover against whom or what it was directed.
Mr. Littleton, you said in the House of Commons last week that you were going out to Kenya to see for yourself and to discuss the measures now being taken to suppress the activities of the Mau Mau. Now, can you tell me more or less how these people operate?
Well, the Mau Mau is a secret society which enforces membership by compelling, very often compelling people to take these oaths, and that's how it's built up its membership.
Now, how many of the 5.5 million Africans in Kenya are members of the Mau Mau?
Well, it's impossible to say. There's some estimates put it as high as 100,000 out of 5.5 million, and some much lower. And of course, you can't tell how many of the, say, 100,000 are voluntary members or how many have joined from intimidation. We had made representations a week after the Colonial Secretary, Oliver Littleton, came here to have talks with him. We met the governor and the Colonial Secretary. The governor at the time was Sir Evelyn Baring. And that was a very futile interview because I think they'd made up their minds before they saw us as to what would be the answer. They wouldn't argue anything with us. We'd made several proposals. And one of the most interesting things about that, the last memorandum submitted by the Kenyan African Union at that meeting, we never asked for independence. We asked that half the legislature should be African and the other half non-African. We asked for the elimination of the color bar. We asked for more educational facilities. We asked for more money to be spent on African agriculture, but we did not ask for independence. It was all thrown overboard.
Mau Mau is not a child of economic pressure, Mr. Littleton told the House of Commons on November the 7th. It feeds not on economic discontent, but on a perverted nationalism and a sort of nostalgia for barbarism.
When Mr. Kenyatta was arrested and the emergency was declared, and this persecution of the people meted out by the British government, British forces over here, that made the people even more determined to continue the fight and to pursue the fight using force. We had no other alternative.